The UK-wide 2004 Gender Recognition Act was originally seen as groundbreaking. It allowed transgender people to apply for legal recognition of the gender in which they lived without undergoing either gender reassignment surgery or other medical treatment. But those who've gone through the process have argued that the requirements placed on applicants are still intrusive and distressing because it requires a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, a condition where a person's biological sex and identity doesn't match. Now the government is considering making that process easier, as Ellie explains.
Well, that's all we've got time for this week, and so make sure you tune in again next week. Follow me on social media, all the rest of it. To play us out this week, we have the wonderful Blur and Girls and Boys.
Sophie Cook began transitioning decades ago, but she only stopped being Steve in 2015. She now hosts a radio show in Brighton, just a few miles down the road from Shoreham, where she stood as the Labour candidate in June's general election.
At the point that I transitioned, I had a choice. I either ended my life or I changed it, because I'd struggled with this pain since I was 7 years old, of feeling emotionally detached from who I was and not feeling like I was the person I was meant to be. And one of the problems is that in the past it's been left down to doctors and judges and this to actually rule on people's identities, and no one can actually presume to know more about someone's identity than they do themselves.
Would everyone please welcome the Prime Minister.
The glitzy Pink News Awards ceremony in October, where the LGBT website awarded the Equalities Minister Justine Greening Politician of the Year for her plans to reform the Gender Recognition Act, something her boss said the government was committed to.
We've set out plans to reform the Gender Recognition Act, streamlining and demedicalising the process for changing gender, because being trans is not an illness and it shouldn't be treated as such.
The current rules mean transgender people can apply for legal recognition of the gender in which they live without having to undergo gender reassignment surgery. But what they do need is a medical diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and then they need to prove that they've been in transition for at least 2 years. When it's launched, the government's consultation will look at taking away that need for a medical diagnosis and essentially free up the individual to self-identify their gender. But some critics of the proposal suggest there are practical as well as philosophical problems with making gender a personal choice.
Should somebody identify themselves as a woman, they could potentially be able to claim the right to be housed in a refuge service with vulnerable women who would find it extremely distressing and potentially intimidating to be housed with that person. But there's also the possibility that people will do that specifically to gain access. And I don't think there's anything that's been built into the discussion so far that has really taken into account the potential for malicious use.
It's difficult to quantify how many people have already or are planning to change gender. Around 300 gender recognition certificates are granted each year. The government said it would launch its consultation this autumn, but it hasn't yet.
We're joined now by the feminist author Julie Bindel and Jane Fay, a campaigner on sexual liberty. Jane, why should it be made easier to transition?
Because it's an absolute dog's breakfast at present, and it actually takes us back to where we were about 40 years ago, because 40 years ago we had exactly a sort of self-identification system and the sky didn't fall in and there were no problems whatsoever.
Right. What concerns do you have, Julie?
Well, first of all, the use of the word gender when what we're talking about is sex. Gender is something that, as a feminist, I firmly believe, and I'm not alone, that gender is a social construct. It's something that's imposed upon girls at birth. It benefits boys. It means that we are supposed to behave in particular ways that, quite frankly, disadvantage us as girls and advantage boys. Now, when I was growing up, I had two brothers, and I wanted the freedom that they had, and I wanted the privilege that they had, that they were given, because of sexism and patriarchy. And quite frankly, had I been taken to a gender reassignment clinic back in the 1970s, I would have happily become a boy, and there was no such thing as gender dysphoria for me. The dysphoria came from not a medical condition which meant I was born in the wrong body, but that as a girl I saw that I had less freedom and less privilege than boys, and also I was treated very unfairly by the outside world.
Right. I mean, taking those points, what do you say to that?
I'm totally confused about that. First and foremost, Julie, you're sort of suggesting that you know what would have happened. I've got a friend who is very definitely lesbian, who went to a gender specialist recently, thought they might have been trans, and the gender specialist sent them away. That's the first thing. Second, what we're talking about today is Gender Recognition Act, and that's got nothing to do with what might have happened to you back then.
Jane, with all due respect, I have interviewed several people who have been through medical transition, through social transition, who deeply regret it, who were diagnosed within 20 minutes by a psychiatrist, who, interestingly, has since been struck off. Because of complaints from several people who've been through the surgery and hormones, and who say that if they'd been allowed to live in their own skin without being bullied for not being a real boy, then they would be happy today. Why are we medicalising what is clearly a problem that's imposed by the patriarchy?
Right, but let's talk about the medicalisation, because is that an issue for you? Is there a danger in people thinking at a certain time when they're really quite young that they are in the wrong body and undertaking something that is difficult to reverse?
There are many things to do in life that are difficult to reverse, and there are many things for which there are far higher regret levels. Okay, can I actually come back to that? This medicalisation thing. If you are aware of transgender history, you'll be very well aware of attempts in the past to try and impose transition on people. They have been disastrous. The transgender community as a whole does not want to recruit. We're not out there evangelising. The only people with an ideology in this are people like Julie. As far as I'm concerned, what we need is the right sort of service which says, if you're lesbian, you're lesbian. If you're trans, you're trans. And
this is actually nothing to do with sexual identity.
Why not?
Because this is to do with the issue that we've been asked to speak about on this programme, the Gender Recognition Act, which has been, excuse me, the cheapest and easiest thing that could be designed by the government to supposedly support trans people, and in fact completely ignore the problems that might mean for female-born women. What it would mean is self-identification, and we have to take this to its natural conclusion, because I've seen this happening in other countries, where you have a man with a beard and a penis who doesn't even bother putting a bit of lippy on, and who goes along to Topshop changing rooms and says, I'm a woman, I self-identify as a woman, let me in now. If I can say erect penis on this programme, please let me.
You've said it now.
So
let's not repeat it again, but anyway, go on.
What we're talking about is a yes,
well, hang on, we're going to come on to that.
What we're talking about is a 15-year-old girl in Topshop changing rooms, and by the way, Topshop is definitely in contradiction with the gender, with the Equality
Let me
Act.
ask Jane, do you accept that could happen, that there is a risk that if there are men self-identifying as women, that they haven't undergone any sort of medical change, that they could then impose themselves, like the woman in the film said, in a refuge, in a women's refuge, or in a change room?
Absolutely no.
Really?
And
They're
Julie,
just self-identification?
Let Jane answer.
Julie, if you actually split the law out, the Gender Recognition Act has zero to do with those things. That is to do with the Equality Act. If you have a problem with that, go and try and reform the Equality Act. The Gender Recognition Act was constructed because of the way the UK law evolved. Trans people were left effectively stateless when it came to gender, and in 2004 we were given some sort of gender back. That covers your birth certificate, it covers your ability to marry, it covered insurance, it covered things like pensions, all of which have now been washed away.
So this is about legal rights, isn't it, rather, in your mind?
Yes, it's
rather
nothing
than
to
medical.
do with going into Topshop or anything like that.
Right. I mean, what do you take away from that discussion? I mean, do you sympathise with what Julie has set out and what one of the contributors in the film set out, that could be the logical conclusion? Or is it just about defining legal rights of trans people, as Jane says?
OK, as a 61-year-old journo who's been around the block a few times, listening to what you said there, you seem to be saying that people would mostly men would self-reassign based on sexual politics. As a woman, you said you would have sexually reassigned because of sexual politics, rather than sexuality, because you wanted to be a boy, because you could see boys were getting a better deal.
Like many girls of whatever sexual orientation that grow up,
or you think that they'll want to self-reassign because they want to perv on women in Topshop. And I just would have suggest to you that although that may happen, the chances of that happening are incredibly small, and I think it's a diversion from the arguments that you're making. That's my personal view.
I was in Topshop. When were you last in Topshop? I was in Topshop 2 weeks back, And this lovely...
This is the world we're talking about, not Topshop.
But yes,
well, you brought Topshop into it.
I mean, Topshop isn't actually going to have its own legislation.
Yes.
Well,
although
yes,
they've had quite a big promotion here, but yeah, go on.
Quite a big... Oh, my gosh, this is the BBC. Yeah. All right, I was in there a couple of weeks ago. This lovely woman in the changing room actually sold me an outfit, which probably I shouldn't have had. And the male changing room assistant went, oh, you're not... And he unsold it. And I thought, gosh, his assistant must be hating him. Now, the key outtake from that is Topshop has male changing room assistants. If you want to go and perv on women, that's what you do. You don't go for...
All right, well, let's bring it... I was going to say, let's bring it back to the broader issue, because you've made that point, and we've had a debate about whether that is, or how likely that is. In terms of legal rights, if the legal rights of trans people are improved by what the government is doing, would you support and be a cheerleader for that?
I think that everybody's legal rights should be protected if we are a protected category, such as women. So women are a protected category. Sex discrimination is a real and valid thing, and that's the reason why we have segregated spaces, because the law recognises that sexual violence is endemic towards girls and women, and the main perpetrators are men. This doesn't mean to say we are all Victorian ladies wanting to have smelling salts in case we see a man anywhere near our changing rooms. This is about self-identification into a protected category. So a man can just decide and declare that he is a woman. Any single bit of legislation that protects women as a protected category will disappear for us, and it will be renamed as gender, which is socially constructed and has nothing to do with sex.
Right. Shouldn't it just have some sort of medical construct? I mean, shouldn't that be retained in what the government is doing?
The medical construct is problematic. First and foremost, it doesn't change trans rights one iota. It doesn't change a thing. It changes the administration, and I wish people would just get that through. It doesn't make it any more or less likely that a pervy guy will go into some changing room somewhere. It doesn't change that one bit. What it does is it takes away, first of all, a panel, where in order to get through that panel you basically need about 500 quid. I've been transitioned... I
thought it was 140 quid, but maybe... I mean...
you need to get some letters, and GPs and so on don't provide those letters, so the total cost is about 450. The other thing is that in order to get there, you have to have some 2 years' worth of living as whatever. Well, in order to do that, you have to get your passport changed to female. You have to get your driving licence changed to female. So, in other words, by the time I would have got to the gender recognition thing, I'd have done all the things I should have done. Also, in this country's legislation, I did get my gender surgery about a year after I started transition. The way the rules work right now is I'd still have to wait a year after I'd had surgery, you know, just in case I changed my mind and wanted everything put back in place or something. I don't quite understand that. So it is about the admin.
Do you think it's been too intrusive, this process, for people like Jane?
I think it's got to be discussed, and actually I think it's something that they've simply got to suck up, actually, because we have to talk about it. And I think programmes like this are very important. I mean, you've raised two issues that had never even occurred to me, actually.
I mean, on that, if I may, Richard, on that line about we have to discuss it, we couldn't even say that Jane was coming on the programme today because several transgender people will bully and force people like Jane, although Jane absolutely will not give in to this, from even discussing this. Feminists have wanted to discuss and debate this, but the cabal, as I call the small group that do not represent trans people, try and shut the debate down.
Why would they want to shut you down like that?
That is completely irrelevant to this, although
it isn't.
It's not irrelevant in the sense, why has it been so unpleasant, the debate around this?
Because people are suggesting that it brings in place... Basically, this is about changing the administrative process. It's about changing the fact that at present, if I were to go in, put down my 450 quid, and the committee, who I never get to see...
But why is it unpleasant? That's what I want to know. Why is there abuse of people like Julie?
Is that, well, there's also abuse of people like me. There's
abuse on both sides. Sure, but why?
I really don't know. Beyond that, I think there has been an onslaught by media. The press have an awful lot to answer for because, as I'm saying, this does not change legal rights at all. It changes process.
It changes it for women.
Press, it does not change it for women.
It changes it for women.
Right.
All right,
and the press have put it out there that it makes changes that it doesn't make.
We're going to have to end it there.